Hello friends, as you are well aware, we have started a new series of lectures, and this time the subject is Indian writing and in English translation. And as we became clear about it, the implication was that much of writing in the post-independence period under this category has been done in English, but English also is a language of translation for us to study, and we take up the modern writers, the 20th century writers in India, who either are available directly in English or through the English translation. So this kind of a thing gives us a wider scope, and we can take more authors as examples of the Indian expression, as we might call it. And today is the second lecture in the series, and Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janki Devi Memorial College University, is the speaker, and she has studied this particular part of writing in India in depth, and she is definitely going to talk about it at a deeper level than otherwise expected from speakers and scholars. So let me, in the beginning, make a few remarks regarding Indian writing in English, and I would like to seek her opinion on this. Indian writing actually is not just Indian, but that Indian, which accepts English as a kind of unifying factor. And that this unifying factor has been there in the 20th century and the late 19th century national movement, because English stood as a kind of link between different regions, and therefore it also seeped into the literary expression in these 150 or so years. So we have this kind of a writing, and the point was made earlier also regarding, when we say Indian English writing, then we are talking about the modern writing that is also available during the national movement and post-independence years. So I would like to ask Professor Payal Nagpal regarding, the character of Indian writing in English, whether it's really modern or contemporary, whether it's positive, whether it's inspiring, whether it is secular, whether it talks about the Indian life in general. And please tell us about the defining features of, modern writing in India, and particularly through English.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. And these are very pertinent questions, when we discuss Indian writing in English. And as you rightly pointed out, literature is available to us in two ways. One is through English as a language, when works are written directly in English. And the other is English as a language of translation. Now, it's interesting, if we look at Indian writing in English, it's a journey, it's an evolutionary process. Because when it started, and if we look at the 19th century, so when it starts in the in a specific form, when it begins in the 19th century, so English is used. There probably might be a gap between what a writer wanted to express and the language that the writer was using, because English at that point was the language of the colonizer and is not something that was available easily in that sense to the native, so to say. So there was that gap, and writers, I think, grappled with the language. They struggled with this language to come into the 20th century, where this language belongs to us. And this is the very fact that we say it is in Indian English. It means that we have lent to the language a lot of words, forms of expression, and in that sense made the language as well as our expression more more fertile and more vibrant and more culture specific. So languages function in different ways, in different zones, in different areas, in different contexts. So that is one to look at it, and today I think the question to say, to really ask whether English is our language or not would be rather dated, because it is there, it is here to stay, it's not going anywhere. So it belongs to us in a certain sense. So it's a dated question. I mean, we have so much literature in the language now, but yet there is this step treatment that is probably met out to Indian English writing. The second is, envisage a situation where we did not have this language. It would be very difficult to arrive probably at a lingua franca that everybody would know, and we would have access to literature from the various bhashas in India. So it's a huge boon at the moment, because when we look at a lot of work in translation, and a lot of translators are winning awards and prizes. So we have access to literature in different languages through English, through their translation into English. So I think these are two very vital areas.
So you see, you have very rightly used a very important word called evolutionary. And the dated part is there, of course, that it always evolves. But would you say something more regarding the process of evolution in India, regarding English writing?
So I think we go back to the preface to Kantapura, for instance, where it's stated that we are probably trying to express emotions that are Indian in a language that is not Indian. But from then to now, to look at, let's say, playwrights like Mahesh Dattani, or to look at playwrights like Girish Karnad, we have arrived at a moment, I think, to look at poets like Kamla Das, to look at Nissim Ezekiel. We have arrived at that moment where that gap between expression and language has been minimized. There might be, of course, there is another theory that, we are able to express ourselves best probably in the language that we know, which is, not English, but let's say in the different Indian languages. Yet at the same time, that gap has been minimized greatly. And, because the language itself has been acculturated in a sense. So, English is also of a different kind now that we have access
Can
to.
you also, for the benefit of the viewer, tell us as to what exactly Raja Rao meant when he said that Indian writing in English, because that writing is mine, I want to speak English. So that gap minimization has something to do with Raja Rao's idea?
So, I think Raja flags that gap for us. Raja Rao flags that gap for us, and puts it down that there is going to be a difference, but that is only the beginning. And I think, be it fiction, be it poetry, be it the prose form, be it drama, there is, a lot today that is published in all these genres, probably the least in, let's say, Indian English drama. But that gap is something that has been, so he constantly talks about how the emotions and the expression are different, and, the language that is being used is going to be different. But the process, I think, the evolutionary process, and as I said, a kind of acculturation, the intermingling of the language with the cultural context, I think, has made the language more vibrant in the Indian context, and has also allowed, the Indian writer access to a language in which they can kind of, make it their own.
One important point that is lurking in the background of your statement is that generally when you write prose, when you write fiction, when you write plays, when you make people talk on the stage, then the other language, the English and the other language, they always remain in the background, and sometimes the Indian native language and sometimes English comes to the forefront. That is of course there. But what about poetry? Because in poetry, the writer generally addresses oneself. Maybe sometimes the writer also visualizes an audience which is not entirely his, but then poetry means self-expression. So that self-expression, you believe, is in the case of English, gets closer to the writer?
So it depends on the context of the writer. There cannot be one rule that applies to everyone. But if I were to talk about Indian English writing and poetry, and because I follow poetry very closely on an annual basis about whatever is published, so there are a whole lot of poets out there. There is some very good poetry that we have in English, and some are of course trying to find their feet, and some of it is very they're taking the early steps. But if we consider the fact that poetry is a form of self-expression, and as a genre, in that sense, it is closest to the person, who's the poet, who's the writer. So there doesn't appear to be any gap, and writers are taking to English as a language in which they are able to express themselves.
And so far as poetry in English is written more in the 20th century than in the 19th century. So, do you think that there is a kind of gap which you are talking about in the early poetic expression through English and the later poetic expression through English?
There would certainly be. There would certainly be, because if we talk about the 19th century, it is a language that is not going to come very naturally in that sense to the writer. It is going to be acquired. To say that it's natural would be a fallacy. So it is going to be acquired, and hence there is going to be a certain kind of gap in the sense between what the writer is really thinking about and what they are expressing through the language. And we can take probably I'm thinking of Torudat's Bianca, for instance. And though of course Torudat writes in a manner that is very English, so to say, and her form of literary expression is more akin to the way in which expression would be in that language, but then it also has little to do with the context that is Indian. So, but then of course there are writers like Krupabai Satyanathan is there, who wrote the first autobiographical novel in English, and then there is Rokea's Sultana's Dream. So there is this writing, and this writers are trying to overcome that and kind of belong more to the language. And of course it comes as time moves on, and it comes to the writer in a more finished form, I think, in the 20th century.
So, friends, there was something in my mind. That's why I made Professor Payal Nagpal have these comments. And I'm now raising the question more, which is more relevant for us for the discussion today. We are, in fact, going to focus upon, Professor Payal Nagpal is going to focus upon a writer who started writing somewhere in the late 60s or 70s, and her name is Kamla Das, and that she perhaps belongs to an evolved kind of poetic expression than was the case with Torudat and with other people. So, over to you regarding Kamla Das to introduce and to tell us what kind of poetry does she belong to.
We'll be discussing Kamla Das today, both in terms of her poems and also in terms of her life writing, which is titled My Story. And with Kamla Das, we see an absolutely new style of writing. And in that sense, maybe Kamla Das has not really got her due, because she wrote feminist poetry of a kind that would not be very palatable to the audience or the reader of the 1960s. So, this is a photograph of Kamla Das from 1990. So she was born into Naya family, in the Malabar area in 1934, and Kamla Das was mostly homeschooled, and she's primarily a poet and writes both in English and in Malayalam, where she's known as Madhavi Kutti. So autobiography was also originally written in Malayalam as Ente Katha and was translated by her as My Story in 1988. So we see a writer here who's writing absolutely rebellious poetry in the 1960s and is writing about her life. She's very ill and she almost thinks she won't be able to make it, and this is the 1970s, and it's in 1988 that it's translated. So this life writing was initially serialized in a Malayalam weekly in 1973. She also converts to Islam in 1999, and she dies as Suraya Begum. So if we talk about...
we will talk about this situation in her case maybe a little later, but you have pointed towards her writing both in Malayalam and in English, and when she writes in Malayalam, then she is perhaps having the reader in Malayalam in her mind, and when she expresses herself through English, maybe then she has a wider audience. And the kind of interaction that you are referring to earlier in the case of two languages, the Indian language and the language of the colonizer, then that gap is gradually becoming limited, and as you use the word minimized. So finally, in my opinion, she emerges as a writer in English. but she is simultaneously writing in both the languages, as you say, and it's not just writing, it's not just expressing, it's also treating life as a kind of subject of experiment. She is living in two different worlds. She lives in two different religions, two faiths, etc. So that generally coincides with her writing. So I would believe that this question also could be slightly expanded on. That she writes in Malayalam, she writes in English, and in both languages she is able to make her point effectively. So I would like to have your a response to this kind of presentation.
So that's the reason actually that I picked up her life writing and also two poems, Grandmother's House and An Introduction. And what the point that you've made about languages is a point that we see in the poem An Introduction, where she talks about the languages that she knows and how she dreams only in one. And there'll be more on that. But the reason why my story is extremely important is because when Kamla Das writes her autobiography, it's not really speaking the norm. And she writes it in both in Malayalam and she also translates it into English. So it is a moment of transition, and women's autobiographies in that sense are very precious narratives because they provide an insight into a world that is power ridden, a world that is complex, and this world we can see through the perspective of the woman here. So it documents her struggles, her victories, and she's blatant and very honest about her life. She talks about her personal life, her sexual life. She's very, very upfront about it. So the autobiography also creates a kind of historical construct for us, which belongs to that particular period. And as a genre, I think in terms of life writing, Kamla Das's My Story, which is why I feel that probably it's never got its due, is that it is a moment of transition. When autobiography opens itself to, it's not as if, from beginning to the end, but it opens itself to moments, it opens itself to issues in women's lives, that had probably been suppressed earlier. So one can see My Story pretty much as a historical marker that allows us to shift from stories of yesteryears to the story of a woman's life in modern India. From, in that sense, autobiographies of the 19th century and early 20th century to one that belongs to the post-independence period.
That's a new word for me, Professor Payal, that she is writing autobiographical stuff. That she is, taking inspiration from her preferences in life, and she wants to talk directly about herself. The word my poem or my story and all these things. So it's mostly individualistic mind. So she's talking about herself, but then her concerns may be shared by her with other people, and that's why the poetry becomes from specific to general. So I think that's also a trait of the Indian writing in English, that the writers, particularly poets, they generally talk about their individual experiences, their growing up, that they are taking influences from their surroundings, and then if the influences are linguistic, then they can use one or the other language, and their own experiences as they were young, as they were adolescents, as they became adults, as they attained maturity, all those things. So basically it is grounded, let's say, in the personal experience of the writer who is taking this genre of poetry seriously and with earnestness. So I believe that at this point of time, we call it a close, the first part of the discussion, that we have a writer called Kamla Das, who writes about herself, about her region, about her language, the basic language that she might have learned from her grandmother or mother, and later on, as she might have expanded the scope and started talking about the general issues also. So this kind of a thing is going to be very interesting, very enriching, and I'm sure that more is to follow with respect to the themes that she directly takes up and responds to the questions through that theme. So we take a short pause, and then we get back to Kamla Das regarding the poems that Professor Payal Nagpal has referred to, whether it's autobiography or an autobiographical element in writing, and for that you have to wait for a few minutes or seconds at least. So we thank you, and very soon we'll take more questions regarding her general nature of expression. Thanks.